The phone sat silent on the chair beside me, not the chair I was sitting in, the other one, the one I had not asked anyone to save, but which the intake nurse had pulled over anyway when I checked in that morning, positioning it close enough that it would be obvious to anyone walking past that it was meant for someone. It was 6:47 a.m. The fluorescent lights in the pre-op waiting area at Mercy General hummed at a frequency I had never noticed before. I noticed it now. I had been in this building twice before, once 5 years ago when Linda was admitted for the last time, and once 3 weeks ago when Dr. Sarah Chen walked me through what the procedure would involve: a spinal stenosis repair, routine by her standards, significant by mine, and asked me to bring someone with me on the day, someone to drive me home, someone to sign the discharge paperwork if I was still too groggy to hold a pen. I had told her my son would be there. I had believed that when I said it. Dr. Chen came through the double doors at 6:51. She was already in her scrubs, a tablet under one arm, and she moved the way surgeons do in the early morning, efficient, unhurried, already somewhere else in her mind. She saw me. She looked at the chair beside me, then back at me. She said, "Mr. Mitchell, how are you feeling this morning?" I told her I was fine. She sat down across from me, not beside me, and pulled up my file on the tablet. She asked the standard questions: blood pressure the night before, last time I had eaten, whether I had taken the prep medication. I answered each one. Then she paused, and I could see her deciding whether to ask the next thing, and she asked it anyway. "Your son, he wasn't able to make it." I said, "He's busy." She nodded once and wrote something on the tablet. She did not press further. That was the thing about Dr. Chen. She had a particular economy of expression that I had come to respect in the 3 appointments we'd had together. She did not fill silences with reassurance. She let them be what they were. What they were this morning was heavy. The call had come the evening before. I was at my kitchen table, going over a materials estimate for a retaining wall project in Cascade Township, the kind of work that had kept Mitchell Construction running for 31 years. The kind of work, Linda used to say, I could do in my sleep. My phone lit up with Ryan's name at 7:14 p.m. I answered on the second ring. He said, "Dad, I'm sorry, but Ashley booked this golf trip months ago. The guys are counting on me. It's just surgery, right? You'll be fine." I did not say anything for a moment. I was looking at the estimate, column of numbers, all of them adding up correctly. I had checked them twice. "I understand," I said. "You're not mad?" "No." "The doctor said it's routine. You said that yourself." "She did say that." "And you'll have the nurses there, and everything." A brief pause, the kind that means someone else is in the room. Then, quieter, like he was repeating something. "You don't really need me to just sit in a waiting room." I had heard that phrase before. Not from Ryan. Ashley had said something close to it at Thanksgiving, when I'd mentioned the surgery was coming up. She'd said, very pleasantly, "Oh, hospitals have wonderful staff now. They really do take care of everything." She had smiled when she said it. I had smiled back. I said, "You're right." There was a pause on his end. I think he had expected more resistance. When he didn't get it, he said, "I'll call you after, as soon as we're done Saturday. I'll call." I told him that would be fine. We said goodbye. I set the phone down on the table and looked at the estimate for another few minutes without reading it. Then I folded it, put it in the folder, and went to bed. A woman named Margaret, 15 years on the pre-op floor, based on the service pin on her scrubs, came by at 7:05 to take my vitals a second time. She had a practiced warmth that was genuine rather than performed, the kind that comes from spending a decade and a half watching people sit in exactly the kind of chair I was sitting in. She wrapped the blood pressure cuff around my arm and waited for the reading. And while she waited, she looked at the empty chair and then at me. And she said, "Is there anyone you'd like me to call family or a friend?" I said, "No, thank you." She removed the cuff. She wrote the numbers down, 128/81. She said, "That's good. You're calm." She said it like a compliment. I wasn't sure calm was the right word. Resolved, maybe, or simply past a certain point. There is a kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from having already made a decision you haven't yet spoken aloud, a decision that sits in the chest like something solid and immovable, waiting. Doctor, Chen came back at 7:20 to tell me they were ready to move me to pre-op. She walked beside me as the orderly wheeled the chair down the corridor, and at some point she looked at her tablet and made a note. I didn't see what she wrote. I found out later, when I requested my records, that it said, "Patient calm. No family present at time of pre-op. Patient declined offer of contact assistance." What the notes did not record was what happened in those 13 minutes between Margaret's question and Dr. Chen's return. What happened was that I sat in that chair and I looked at the empty seat beside me, and I thought about the last time someone had sat in a chair like that while I was the one being wheeled somewhere. That was 28 years ago, on a job site outside of Grand Rapids. And the man sitting in the waiting room, the one who had refused to leave until he knew I was out of surgery, was named Michael Brooks. He had pulled me out of a collapsed trench with his own hands. He had waited 4 hours. He had not told anyone he was there. He had just been there. Michael had been dead for 8 years. His son was 31 years old and teaching algebra at a middle school in Kentwood. And in the morning light of Mercy General, with the fluorescent hum above me and the empty chair beside me, I reached for my phone. Linda had been gone 5 years, and I still set 2 cups out every morning before I caught myself. It's not something I planned. It was just muscle memory, 41 years of reaching for 2 mugs, 2 spoons, the same ceramic pot she'd bought at a craft fair in 1992. I'd stand there in the kitchen on Birchwood Drive with both cups on the counter and realize what I'd done, and I'd put one back. And I'd drink my coffee standing up because sitting at the table alone still felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't done it. Ryan had been there at the end. I want to say that first because it matters, and because the man who stood in that hospital corridor 5 years ago was someone I recognized my son, the boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder at baseball games, who called me from his freshman dorm at Michigan State just to tell me about his day. He had driven to Mercy General every morning for 11 days during Linda's final decline. He sat in the chair beside her bed and held her hand and talked to her even when she couldn't answer. On the last night, when the nurses had dimmed the lights and the machines had gone quiet, Ryan had pressed his forehead against her hand and wept in a way I hadn't seen since he was 6 years old and had fallen off his bicycle on the driveway. I remember standing in the doorway watching him and thinking, whatever else happens, he is a good son. I held on to that thought for a long time, longer than I should have, maybe, because what I didn't understand yet was that grief does strange things to people, and that some people, when the loss is too big and the pain is too close, choose to walk away from anything that reminds them of what they've lost. I was the thing that reminded Ryan of his mother. The house on Birchwood Drive reminded him of his mother. The ceramic pot, the baseball games, the way I still sometimes said, "Your mother used to," before catching myself, all of it reminded him. And I think it hurt him in ways he didn't know how to carry. So he found someone to help him put it down. Her name was Ashley. He brought her to dinner about 14 months after Linda passed, and she was pleasant in the careful way of someone who is prepared for a first impression. She asked about my work, the company, the projects, whether I'd been doing anything interesting lately, and she listened with her head tilted slightly and her hands folded on the table. She called me Mr. Mitchell, and then, when I said she could call me James, she said, "Thank you, James," in a way that sounded practiced. I noticed it, the way you notice a small misalignment in a foundation, something technically fine, technically level, but off by a fraction that only shows up later. I told Ryan she seemed like a good woman. I meant it, or I meant it enough. They married 18 months later. I stood beside my son at the altar of a church in East Grand Rapids and thought about Linda and tried not to let it show on my face. And Ryan looked happy, and I was glad he was happy. I drove home that night and set 2 cups out without thinking and stood there in the kitchen for a long time before I put one back. The shift was gradual. That's the thing about gradual shifts. You don't have an event to point to. You don't have a date to mark on the calendar. You just have a slow accumulation of small things that only add up when you look back at all of them together. The phone calls got shorter. Ryan had always called on Sunday evenings, not every Sunday, but most of them, a habit we'd had since his college years. After the wedding, the calls started ending differently. "Dad, I have to go. Ashley's waiting." Said without apology. Said the way you say, "I have to go. My ride is here." Something logistical. Nothing personal. I told myself it was normal. Married people had schedules. I understood that. The first Christmas was the one that registered. We had always done Christmas Eve on Birchwood Drive, Linda's tradition, carried forward after she was gone because neither Ryan nor I could think of a reason to stop. He called me the week before and said Ashley's parents had invited them to their house in Ann Arbor, and he hoped I understood, and they'd try to come by on the 26th. I said, of course. I understood. They didn't come on the 26th. Something came up. The second Christmas, I didn't wait to hear. I called a former colleague named Pete Hartley, who'd retired from the company 3 years earlier, and we had dinner at a restaurant on Fulton Street that was open on holidays. Pete's wife had passed a few years before Linda, and we didn't talk about it much, but we didn't need to. The food was decent. I was home by 9. About a year and a half into the marriage, Ryan said something that I've turned over in my mind many times since. We were on the phone a Sunday, one of the shorter ones, and he said, "Dad, I think you should start dating again. You're alone too much. It's not healthy." I sat with that for a moment before I answered. I knew what he meant. Not the surface of it, not the actual suggestion, which was considerate enough on its face, but the layer underneath. He meant, I don't want to worry about you. I don't want to feel guilty about not calling. I don't want to think about you sitting in that house by yourself. He meant if you had someone else to look after you, I wouldn't have to. He didn't say any of that. He probably didn't even know he was saying it. But I'd spent 40 years reading the difference between what a project looks like on paper and what's actually happening in the ground. And I knew. I said, "I'm fine. Ryan, don't worry about me." He said, "Okay, Dad, I just want you to be happy." I told him we said goodbye. I hung up and sat in the kitchen with my coffee and didn't move for a while. After that, even the Sunday calls became irregular. Some weeks there was a text instead. "How are you?" Hope work is good scent, I suspected. From Ashley's vicinity. From some Saturday afternoon when she'd looked up from whatever she was doing and said, "When did you last check in on your dad?" And he'd reached for his phone and typed 12 words and felt the obligation discharged. I answered those texts. I said I was fine. I was careful not to say too much because I had learned that too much was its own kind of pressure, and I didn't want to be pressure. There was a version of Ryan Mitchell who had sat in a hospital chair for 11 days and held his mother's hand. I knew that man existed because I had watched him. And there was the version who sent 12-word texts from somewhere I couldn't picture, managed by a schedule I wasn't part of, drifting in a direction that had nothing to do with me. I had not lost my son to cruelty. I want to be precise about that. Ryan was not a bad man. He was a man who had found it easier, over time, to be elsewhere and had found someone who made elsewhere feel like the right choice. I understood it. I had watched enough structures fail to know that the problem is rarely one bad beam. It's the accumulation of small loads in the wrong places over enough time until something gives. I had understood all of this for a long time before the morning I lay in a hospital bed waiting for surgery, looked at the chair beside me, and reached for my phone. The call came at 7:31 in the evening. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the pre-op instructions doctor. Chen's office had sent over a single sheet listing what I couldn't eat, what I couldn't take, what time I needed to arrive. I had read it twice already. When my phone lit up with Ryan's name, I set the sheet down and looked at it for one full ring before I answered. I already knew what the call was about. That's the part I find difficult to explain to people who haven't spent 30 years reading job sites. You develop a sense for load before the crack appears. I had told Ryan about the surgery 3 weeks earlier. He had said, "Of course, Dad, I'll be there." He had said it the way people say things when they mean to mean them, but haven't yet checked their calendar. "Hey, Dad!" His voice was easy. That was the first thing I noticed, how easy it was. "Listen, I'm really sorry, but I can't make it tomorrow. Ashley and I booked this golf trip to Scottsdale like 6 months ago. The guys are already here, and I can't back out now." I said, "You booked it before I told you about the surgery." "I mean, we planned it a long time ago. But honestly, Dad, Ashley called the hospital last week. She talked to someone in pre-op and asked whether they required a family member present. They said no. They said the nurses handle everything. So," he said it like that settled something. Like a phone call to a stranger was the same as being there. "It's just bad timing." I looked at the pre-op sheet. The arrival time was printed in bold 6 o'clock. I said, "Could you fly back early before they take me in?" "Dad, come on." There it was, that particular tone, patient and slightly tired, the tone of a man explaining something obvious to someone being unreasonable. "It's just a procedure. You'll be in recovery, sleeping. I'll call you after." Just a procedure. I have thought about those 3 words many times since that evening. Not because they were cruel, they weren't. Ryan didn't say them to wound me. He said them the way a person says something when they have already decided and need the other person to agree quickly so the conversation can end. It was the sound of a man who had categorized the situation and moved on before the call was finished. That was what landed. Not the golf trip, not Scottsdale, the categorization. I had a surgery scheduled for 6 in the morning to remove a growth from my left kidney that Dr. Chen had described carefully as something we want to address sooner rather than later. I had sat in her office and listened to her explain the procedure, the recovery window, the things that could go wrong. I had driven home alone afterward and sat in the driveway for 11 minutes before going inside. And somewhere between that conversation and this one, my son had looked at the same information and arrived at the phrase, "just a procedure." I said, "I understand. Ryan, have a good trip." A pause, brief, maybe 2 seconds. Then, "Thanks, Dad. I knew you'd understand. You're the best." He said it warmly, genuinely. I think, "I'll call you when you're out of recovery." "Okay, keep your phone on." "Sure," I said. He hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a while without moving. The pre-op sheet was still in front of me. Outside, the neighbor's porch light came on a motion sensor triggered by something I couldn't see from where I was sitting. It stayed on for 30 seconds, then went dark again. I'm not a man who makes decisions quickly. I built a company over 26 years by understanding that the worst choices are the ones made in the first 5 minutes of anger. So I sat there, and I was careful about what I was feeling, and I tried to be fair. Ryan had a trip planned. He had friends who had traveled. He had a wife who had her own ideas about how weekends should be spent. These were real things. I did not dismiss them. But I kept returning to those 3 words. Just a procedure. Not "I'm sorry I can't be there." Not "I wish I could come." Just a procedure, as though the question were not about him being present, but about whether my being there required presence at all, as though I were a task that the hospital would handle, and he could check on afterward. I thought about Linda. She had died in a hospital room, and I had not left that room for the last 4 days of her life. I had slept in a chair that left marks on my back for a week. Ryan had visited twice. He had things to get back to. I had not said anything about that then, and I did not say anything now. What I did was pick up the phone again. I scrolled to a different name. I looked at it for a moment, then pressed call. It rang twice. I sat on the edge of the bed, the same bed I'd been sitting on when Ryan called. The window was dark now, not late, just overcast, the kind of February sky that closes in around 4 in the afternoon and doesn't let go. I hadn't moved since hanging up. I wasn't angry. That was the thing I kept noticing. I had expected anger, or something close to it, But what I felt instead was a kind of settling, the way a level reads when you finally get the surface right. Everything going still, everything becoming clear. I knew who I needed to call. I'd had Daniel Brooks's number in my phone for 8 years. I'd updated it twice when he changed carriers, once when he moved from the apartment on Wealthy Street to the house on the east side of Grand Rapids. I knew his address, his school schedule, the name of his department head at the middle school where he taught. I knew these things not because I kept records, I don't. Not personal ones, but because when you make a promise to a dying man, you don't let the details slip. His name was in my contacts under D. Not Daniel with a last name attached. Not Michael's son, which is how I still sometimes thought of him in quieter moments. Just Daniel, the way you'd list someone who doesn't need a label. I pressed call. It rang twice. James, his voice came through warm and immediate, the kind of answer that means someone actually looked at the screen before picking up. How are you? I was just thinking about you. I drove past the Riverside project yesterday. The one on Leonard. Looks like they're finally pouring the foundation. They are, I said, 2 weeks behind, but they're moving. It's better than 6 weeks behind. It is. There was a beat. Not uncomfortable. Daniel had always known how to let a conversation find its own footing. It was something his father had known too. Daniel, I said, I have a favor to ask. Sure, no hesitation, no shift in register. Tomorrow I'm having surgery. It's a hip replacement, not an emergency. Scheduled. I'll be at Spectrum Health Butterworth, downtown. I go in at 7. I paused. I would like you to be there, in the waiting room. I need someone I can trust. I had not planned that last sentence. It came out the way true things sometimes do, without permission. There was no pause on his end, no sound of a calendar being checked, no intake of breath that meant he was calculating. He said, I'll be there. What time do you need me? And which entrance, the main one on Michigan Street? Main entrance, I said. 6:30 would be enough. You don't have to stay the whole time. I'll stay, he said. Do you need a ride? I can pick you up. I'll drive myself tonight. Stay nearby. But thank you. Okay. A brief quiet. James, is there anything else you need before tomorrow? Or after? He did not ask why Ryan wasn't coming. He did not ask whether I had called anyone else first. He asked what I needed, and he asked it the way people ask when they actually want to know the answer, not as a formality, not as a door they expect to close quickly. No, I said, just that, just someone there. Then I'll be there, he said again. 6:30, main entrance. I'll bring coffee. After I hung up, I sat for another minute. The room was quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street, its headlights sliding across the ceiling and gone. I thought about the way Daniel had answered not, I'll try to make it work, or let me see what I can do. Just, I'll be there. What time? Which entrance? I thought about what it means to be the kind of person who answers that way, whether it's something you're born with or something that gets built into you slowly by the people who showed up for you when you needed it. I didn't have an answer for that. I turned off the lamp, lay back on the bed, and looked at the ceiling in the dark for a while. I had surgery in the morning. Someone would be there. That was enough. The first thing I want to tell you about Michael Brooks is that he was not a careful man. He was a good man, one of the best I've ever known, but careful was never the word for him. He moved through the world the way some people do, like the space in front of him was always a little more negotiable than it actually was. On a construction site, that kind of confidence is useful right up until the moment it isn't. We'd been working together for 3 years when the accident happened. This was 1996, late October, a commercial development outside Grand Rapids, a strip mall that nobody remembers now, probably a chain pharmacy or a mattress store in its place. I was 34. Michael was 32. We were both crew supervisors, which meant we were both on the site when we should have been in the trailer doing paperwork, and neither of us cared. The crane had been showing stress signals for 2 days. I'd logged it in the maintenance book. The equipment company said they'd send someone Friday. It was Wednesday when the cable housing cracked. I was under the load when it shifted. Not directly, I wasn't standing in the drop zone. I knew better than that, but the counterbalance swung and a secondary beam came loose from the staging, and I went down before I understood what had happened. One moment I was standing. The next I was on the ground with 300 pounds of steel channel pinning my left leg and the lower back, and I could not move, and I could not breathe well. And the site had cleared fast because everyone else heard the cable go and ran the way you're trained to run. Michael didn't run. I know this because I was watching from the ground. I could turn my head enough to see him. He'd been 20 yards away when it happened, and he turned toward the sound instead of away from it, which is the opposite of what the training says to do. And he came across that site at a run and didn't stop when he reached me. He assessed it in about 4 seconds. I could see him calculating, the way he always did, that particular stillness behind his eyes, and then he got his hands under the beam and lifted. He was not a large man. Michael was 5'10", maybe 170 pounds. The beam was 300 pounds of steel channel, wet from the morning rain, resting on uneven ground. He lifted it anyway. Not all the way. He couldn't clear it entirely, but enough. Enough for me to drag myself out while he held it. I felt something tear in my shoulder doing it, and didn't care. I got clear. He set the beam down. He'd torn 3 muscles in his right arm and 2 in his lower back. He didn't say anything about it until we were both sitting against the site trailer waiting for the ambulance. He said, "I think I overdid it." And I looked at him, and his shirt was soaked through, and his arm was hanging at a wrong angle, and I said, "Michael, your arm." He looked at it like he was seeing it for the first time. He said, "Huh." He spent 6 days in the hospital. I spent 4. His recovery took longer than mine, which I thought about for years afterward, the way a man can pay a price for something and never fully collect what he's owed for it. We didn't talk about what happened in any formal way. Men of our generation, in our line of work, didn't process things out loud. We went back to work. We had lunch together twice a week. We went to each other's houses for holidays. When Linda and I had trouble getting pregnant, Michael was the one I told first. When Michael's wife left, Daniel was 6, and she left on a Tuesday. And Michael called me that night from a gas station parking lot because he didn't want Daniel to hear him on the phone. I drove to that parking lot and sat with him for 2 hours without either of us saying much of anything useful. That was the nature of it. 28 years of showing up. That's what the friendship was. The cancer came 8 years ago, pancreatic, which is the kind that doesn't negotiate. Michael was 56. He went from diagnosis to hospice in 7 months, which his doctor said was actually longer than they'd expected, and which felt, to everyone who loved him, like no time at all. I drove to Charlotte Regional every other day during those last weeks. The hospice wing was on the 4th floor, north side, and the hallway always smelled like industrial cleaner and something underneath it that I never named. Michael's room had a window that looked out over a parking structure. He said once that it was the least scenic view he'd ever had, and then he laughed, and the laugh turned into a cough, and I handed him the water cup, and we didn't say anything for a while after that. The last real conversation happened on a Thursday afternoon in November. His son Daniel had stepped out. He was 23 then, teaching his first year at a middle school in Raleigh, driving up on weekends, and Michael and I were alone for the first time in several visits. He was more alert than he'd been in days. That happened sometimes near the end, a kind of gathering. He looked at me for a long time before he spoke. I let him. "James," he said, "I need to ask you something." I said, "Ask." He was quiet again. He was choosing his words with the particular care of a man who knows he doesn't have unlimited chances to use them. "Daniel," he said, "he's going to be alone. You know that. His mother's gone. He's got the school. He's got his friends. But," he stopped. He looked at the window, the parking structure, the flat gray sky behind it. "He doesn't have anyone who's been watching out for him. Not the way a person needs." I didn't say anything. I was listening. "I need you to watch over him." Michael said, "Not like a father. He doesn't need a replacement father. He's a grown man." He paused. "But someone who cares. Someone he can trust. Someone who picks up when he calls." He looked back at me. "Can you do that?" I said, "Michael, I promise you, I will be there for Daniel." He held my eyes for a moment, then something in his face settled, not relief exactly, but something like it. The particular stillness of a man who has finished one of the things he needed to finish. "I know you will," he said. "That's why I'm asking." He died 3 days later, on a Sunday morning, with Daniel beside him. I was in the parking structure below. I'd gone to move my truck, and by the time I got back to the 4th floor, it was already done. The nurse at the desk looked at me when I came off the elevator, and I understood from her face before she said a word. I kept the promise without announcing it. That was the only way I knew how to keep a promise quietly, over time, in the specific currency of showing up. When Daniel needed money for his graduate certification program, I wrote a check and told him it was a loan and never mentioned it again. When he called me at 11 on a weeknight because a woman he'd been seeing for 2 years had ended things without much explanation and he didn't know what to do with that, I sat on my back porch in the dark and listened to him talk for an hour and a half. When he finished his first year of teaching and the school held a small recognition ceremony, I drove 40 minutes to be there. He seemed surprised to see me. He shouldn't have been. He never knew about the promise. I didn't tell him, and it didn't seem like Michael had told him either. As far as Daniel knew, I was simply a man his father had trusted, someone who had stayed in his life after Michael was gone. He didn't know I'd made a specific commitment in a hospice room on a Thursday afternoon in November. He only knew what he could see, that when he called, I answered, that when he needed someone, I was there. There's a difference, I've come to understand, between love that announces itself and love that simply continues. One of them needs to be seen. The other one doesn't. Michael had known the difference. He demonstrated it 28 years ago on a construction site in Grand Rapids when he turned toward the sound instead of away from it. I thought about all of this lying in the dark the night before my surgery. I thought about the cable housing that cracked on a Wednesday. I thought about a man who ran the wrong direction and held up 300 pounds of steel with everything he had. I thought about a parking structure in Charlotte and a gray November sky, and a conversation that lasted maybe 8 minutes and covered everything that mattered. I thought about Daniel's voice on the phone. What time? Which entrance? Michael had built something into that boy, some architecture of showing up, and I had tried, for 8 years, to reinforce it, to be, as Michael had asked, someone Daniel could trust. What I hadn't fully understood until that night was that Daniel had been building something into me too. That trust goes both directions, that a person who keeps showing up for you is also teaching you what showing up looks like. I turned that over in the dark for a while. I had surgery in the morning. I knew who would be there. The next morning, I got up at 5:15, the same time I'd been getting up since I started in construction at 23. Old habits don't leave, they just find new reasons. I made coffee, drank half of it standing at the kitchen window, and watched the neighbor's dog cross the yard in the early dark. The surgery wasn't until 10. I had time. I wasn't thinking about the surgery, I was thinking about Daniel. There's a particular kind of person who shows up without being asked. Not the person who responds to a crisis. Most people will do that, at least once. I mean the person who shows up on a Tuesday in March when nothing is wrong, just to drop off soup because they heard you'd been working late. The person who calls on a Sunday, not because they need something, but because they remembered you mentioned your wife's birthday was that week, and they figured you might want someone to talk to. That kind of showing up is rarer than people think. It doesn't happen by accident. Someone taught it to them. Michael had taught it to Daniel. I was certain of that. And somewhere in the 8 years since Michael died, I had tried to be present enough that Daniel didn't lose the lesson. What I hadn't expected was that Daniel would teach it back to me. He called around 4 that afternoon, the day before the surgery. I was in the garage going through a box of old project files, Linda's organizational system, still intact, still labeled in her handwriting. I'd been meaning to reorganize them for 2 years and kept not doing it. "Hey, James," Daniel said, "I wanted to drop off something at your place. Can I come by?" I said, "Of course." He arrived 40 minutes later in his blue Civic, the one with the dented rear bumper he'd been meaning to fix since last spring. He was still in his school clothes khakis, a green button-down, the kind of outfit that said he'd come straight from 7th period without stopping home first. He was carrying something wrapped in brown paper, roughly the size of a hardback book, held under his arm like it might get away from him if he wasn't careful. We sat at the kitchen table. I offered coffee. He said yes, then changed his mind to water. I brought both. He set the package on the table between us and didn't say anything for a moment. That was another thing Michael had given him, the ability to be quiet without filling the silence with noise. Most 31-year-olds can't do that. Most people of any age can't. I found this last year, he said, going through some of Dad's things I'd been putting off. He looked at the package. I should have given it to you sooner. I kept thinking I'd wait for the right time. I don't think there is a right time for something like this. I just kept holding on to it. He slid it across the table. I unwrapped it. The paper came away in 2 folds. Underneath was a journal, the old kind, with a dark brown leather cover worn soft at the corners, the spine slightly cracked from use. Someone had written on the cover in blue ink, careful block letters, for James. I recognized the handwriting. I'd seen it on birthday cards, on notes passed across job site trailers, on the back of a napkin once when Michael sketched out a load-bearing calculation because he didn't have paper and the problem couldn't wait. Michael's handwriting had a particular quality. The letters leaned slightly forward, like they were in a hurry to get somewhere. I didn't open it right away. I just held it. "There's a note inside," Daniel said, "from him. And then I wrote something too, at the back. You don't have to read it now." I opened the front cover. Michael's handwriting, a full page, dated about 3 months before he died. "James, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And if Daniel gave this to you, it means he understands now what you did, what it cost you, what it was worth. He's a good man. I know that because you helped make sure of it. Not by doing anything dramatic, just by being there. That's what I asked you for, and that's what you gave him. Tell him I'm proud, and tell him you're proud too. He needs to hear both. He'll believe yours more than he believes mine, because you're still here and I'm not. That's just how it works. Thank you for keeping your word. I knew you would. That's why I asked." I turned to the back. Daniel's handwriting, neater than his father's, more careful, the letters fully upright, the handwriting of a man who'd spent years writing on whiteboards for teenagers who needed to see it clearly. "James, you kept Dad's promise. That's all he asked. That's all I needed. I know it wasn't always easy. I know there were years when I wasn't easy. You showed up anyway. When I had the flu that February and couldn't get off the couch, you drove 40 minutes to bring soup and didn't make a thing of it. When Elena left and I didn't want to talk to anyone, you sat in my living room for 4 hours and we barely said 20 words, and somehow that was exactly right. When I got the job at Riverside, you were the first person I called, and you picked up on the second ring, and you said, I knew you'd get it, like it was already decided. I used to think showing up was something you did for other people. I understand now that it's something you do together. You taught me that. Dad started it. You finished it. Thank you for being there." I read it twice. Then I closed the journal and set it on the table and looked at the window for a while. The light outside had gone the particular gray gold of late afternoon in November, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's being remembered rather than seen. Daniel didn't say anything. He drank his water and waited. I had kept Michael's promise because I said I would, and because Michael had once pulled me out from under a collapsed scaffold beam, and I owed him a debt I could never fully repay. That was the honest accounting of it. I had shown up for Daniel because Michael asked me to, and because it was the right thing, and because I'd made a commitment in a hospital room 28 years ago, and I was not the kind of man who walked away from commitments. What I had not expected, what I had not allowed myself to expect, was that it would feel like this. That the obligation I had carried would someday stop feeling like weight and start feeling like something else entirely. I stood up and crossed around the table and put my arms around Daniel, and he stood up and let me. And we stayed like that for a moment in my kitchen with the coffee going cold on the counter and the November light coming through the window. When I sat back down, I didn't trust my voice immediately, so I waited. Daniel sat back down too. He looked like his father around the eyes, that particular steadiness, the way some people have of looking at you like they have all the time in the world. "Your father," I said finally, "was the best man I ever knew." Daniel nodded. "I know. You're not far behind." He looked at the table. He wasn't comfortable with compliments, another thing he'd gotten from Michael, who used to deflect praise by immediately talking about something else. "I have surgery tomorrow," I said. "I know, 10 o'clock. Riverside Memorial, main entrance." I hadn't told him the entrance. He shrugged slightly. "I called the hospital this morning to check the parking situation. Figured I'd be there early." I picked up my coffee cup. It was cold. I drank it anyway. For 8 years I had shown up for Daniel because I promised Michael I would. I had done it willingly, and I had done it because it was right. But underneath all of it, there had always been the quiet weight of obligation, the knowledge that this was something I owed, a debt being slowly paid. Sitting at that table with the journal between us and Daniel, already knowing which entrance to use tomorrow morning, I understood something I should have understood years earlier. The debt had been paid a long time ago. What was left wasn't obligation. It was just love. I set the cup down and looked at the journal. Michael's handwriting on the cover. For James. He'd written it for me before he died, and he'd trusted Daniel to know when to give it. And Daniel had waited until the night before my surgery, not by accident. I thought, not by accident at all. I had surgery in the morning. I knew who would be there. And, for the first time in longer than I could remember, that knowledge didn't feel like a small thing. It felt like everything. The recovery room was quieter than I expected. That was the first thing I noticed when I came back. Not the light, not the antiseptic smell, not the familiar dull ache in my chest where they'd gone in. The quiet. Hospital rooms have a particular kind of silence, the kind that exists underneath the sounds, rather than instead of them. Monitors beeping at intervals, the soft pull of an IV line, somewhere down the hall, a cart being wheeled over linoleum. I opened my eyes slowly. The ceiling was white. Then I turned my head, and there was Daniel. He was sitting in the chair beside the bed with a paperback open in his lap, something with a worn spine, a library book by the look of it. He was reading, or had been reading, but the moment my eyes moved, he looked up. Not because I made a sound. I don't think I made a sound. He just knew. He set the book down on the windowsill without marking his page. "Welcome back," he said. His voice was even unhurried. "You did great. Doctor said everything went well." He smiled, not the wide, performative smile people give you when they're relieved and want you to see the relief. Just a small, quiet smile, the kind that doesn't ask anything of you. Then he stood and reached for the cup of water on the tray table. He adjusted the straw so it faced me. He moved the pillow behind my head without asking if I wanted it moved, because he'd been watching long enough to know. I didn't say anything for a while. There wasn't anything I needed to say. "Doctor," Chen came in about 20 minutes later. I'd lost track of time, which happens when your body is still burning off anesthesia. She was carrying my chart, and she was already reviewing something on it when she walked through the door. She looked at Daniel first, the way doctors do when they enter a room and need to take stock of who's present. Then she looked at me. "How are you feeling, Mr. Mitchell?" "Like someone opened my chest," I said. She almost smiled. "That's accurate." She checked the monitor readings, made a note, then looked at Daniel again. "Is this your son?" I thought about the question for a moment. "Not long. Not by blood," I said. "By choice." "Doctor," Chen looked at me for a beat, then wrote something in the chart. She didn't comment on it. She didn't need to. Whatever she wrote it carefully, which is the only thing I noticed. After she left, the room was quiet again. Daniel had settled back into the chair. He didn't fill the silence with conversation. He didn't tell me about his drive in, or what he'd had for breakfast, or ask me how I was feeling now that the doctor had already asked. He was just there. There is no other way to say it. He was simply, completely, without condition or agenda, there. My phone was on the tray table. I could see the screen from where I lay. At 3:14 in the afternoon, it lit up. "Ryan." I answered it. My voice was rougher than I expected the intubation. Doctor Chen had warned me, would leave my throat sore for a day or two. "Hey, Dad." His voice was bright, easy. There was noise behind him, wind and other voices, and what sounded like the specific acoustic quality of an open outdoor space. "How did it go?" "Good," I said. "I'm out. Everything went well." "That's great. That's really great." A pause. Someone behind him said something I couldn't make out. "Listen, we're about to tee off, so I'll call you tomorrow. Okay, get some rest." "Sure," I said. "Love you, Dad." "Yep." The call ended. I set the phone back on the tray table. The screen went dark. Daniel was holding the water cup out toward me without a word. He'd noticed my hand moving toward the tray table and anticipated what I might want. Or maybe he'd just decided I needed water and was offering it regardless. I took it. I drank slowly, which is all you can do with a sore throat and a straw. I didn't look at the phone again. I looked at Daniel. He wasn't watching me with an expression that said, "I heard that," or "I'm sorry," or "Can you believe him?" He wasn't watching me at all. Not directly. He'd given me the privacy of looking slightly away, toward the window, where the late afternoon light was coming in gray and even through the blinds. His hands were loose in his lap. His book was still on the windowsill. He was just there. I had spent 62 years learning that presence was something people promised easily and delivered poorly. I had learned it from job sites where men said they'd show up and didn't, from contracts that fell apart in the language of intentions, from a son who called from a golf course to say he'd call tomorrow. Presence, I had come to understand, was not a feeling. It was not an emotion you reported. It was a location. It was the physical fact of a body in a chair beside a hospital bed at 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, for no reason except that someone had asked and you had come. Daniel hadn't even asked why I'd called him. He'd just come. I looked at the window. The light was fading. Somewhere in the building, a PA system made an announcement I couldn't parse, and then the quiet settled back in around us. I thought about Michael. I thought about the job site in 1996 and the weight of a beam, and a man who had moved without thinking. I thought about a hospital room not unlike this one 8 years ago, and a promise I had made at the end of it. Take care of my boy. I had tried. For 8 years I had tried, in the ways I knew how, tuition payments and phone calls and showing up. But sitting in that room, with Daniel beside me and the phone dark on the tray table, I understood that the accounting had shifted. I was not the one who had been taking care of anyone. I closed my eyes. Daniel didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He was there. 3 days after the surgery, I woke up at 4:47 in the morning and lay still for a long time, watching the ceiling. The hospital room had a particular quality of darkness at that hour, not full dark, but the gray-blue of fluorescent lights filtered through a half-closed door. The monitors made their sounds. The IV line ran into my left arm, outside the window. The parking lot was empty except for a maintenance truck idling near the entrance, its orange hazard lights turning slowly. Daniel was asleep in the chair to my right. He'd pulled his jacket over himself like a blanket. His shoes were still on. He'd fallen asleep that way 2 nights in a row, and each time I'd watched him and thought about his father, about Michael, who had slept the same way, in that particular upright posture of a man who expected to be needed and didn't want to miss the call. I reached for my phone on the tray table. The screen showed 4:47, then 4:48. I had Margaret Walsh's number memorized. I had been her client for 20 years, since Linda and I first drew up our wills the year Ryan turned 14, and we decided we should stop putting it off. Margaret had handled the amendment when Linda got sick. She had handled the estate after. She knew the shape of my family the way a contractor knows the bones of a building, not from the outside, but from the inside, from what holds it up and what doesn't. I dialed. It rang 4 times. Then her voice, careful and alert, in the way of someone who kept their phone close, even at odd hours. James. Margaret, I'm sorry for the hour. Don't be. Are you all right? Is something wrong medically? No, I'm fine. The surgery went well. I'm recovering. I paused. I need to change my will. Today. A silence. Not the silence of sleep, but the silence of a lawyer thinking. James, you're still in the hospital. This can wait. Margaret, it can't. I heard my own voice and was surprised by it. Not loud, not urgent, but certain in a way I hadn't heard from myself in some time. I need to change my will. Today. She didn't argue after that. I had been her client for 20 years, and I think she recognized something in my voice that she had heard before, once, when I called her 3 weeks after Linda was diagnosed and told her I needed everything reviewed and updated before anything else happened. She had recognized it then, to the voice of a man who has finished deliberating and is ready to act. All right, she said. Tell me what you want. I told her, I want to leave the house on Birchwood Drive to Daniel Brooks. I want to leave my retirement account and my life insurance policy to Daniel Brooks. I want the business Mitchell Construction to be sold, and I want the proceeds to go into a scholarship fund established in the name of Michael Brooks. Michael was a man who believed in showing up for people. I want the fund to reflect that. Kids who want to go into skilled trades and can't afford the training. That's what Michael would have wanted, and I know it because I knew him for 30 years. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then, what about Ryan? Ryan will receive $50,000. Another pause. James. That was his mother's number, I said. Linda and I talked about it once, years ago, before she got sick. She said she wanted Ryan to have something to start with if anything ever happened to us. Something real, but not so much that it would replace the work of building a life. $50,000. That was her number. I'm keeping it. And the rest of the house, the retirement account, the life insurance, all of it to Daniel Brooks. Yes. This is a significant change. Margaret said, I want to make sure you understand the full scope of what you're describing. The house alone. I know what the house is worth. Margaret, I built it. That wasn't quite true. I hadn't built it myself, but I had overseen every phase of its construction, and I knew its value down to the foundation. I knew what the retirement account held. I knew what the life insurance policy paid out. I had spent 3 days lying in a hospital bed with nothing to do but think, and I had done the arithmetic more than once. Are you sure? She asked. I've never been more sure about anything in my life. The words came out flat and even, not dramatic, just true. Margaret was quiet for a moment longer, and then I heard the particular sound of her exhaling, not a sigh, exactly, but the sound of a decision being accepted. I'll draw up the papers, she said. You can sign them tomorrow. I'll need 2 witnesses who aren't beneficiaries. Can you arrange that at the hospital? I'll ask Dr. Chen. Good. I'll have everything ready by noon. I thanked her and ended the call. The screen went dark. I set the phone back on the tray table and lay still, looking at the ceiling again. The maintenance truck outside had stopped idling. The parking lot was quiet. From the chair to my right, I heard Daniel shift, then his voice, low and careful, the voice of someone who had been more awake than he appeared. Everything okay? I looked at him. He had straightened in the chair, jacket still across his shoulders, watching me with the same expression I had seen on his face 3 days ago in the waiting room, not anxious, not demanding anything, just present, just there. Yes, I said, everything is exactly as it should be. He nodded once and settled back. He didn't ask what the call had been about. He didn't ask who I had called at 5 in the morning or why. He pulled the jacket back around himself and closed his eyes, and within a few minutes, his breathing had evened out again. I lay awake for another hour, watching the light change outside the window as the parking lot began to fill. Ew. Margaret arrived at 11:53 the following morning, a Tuesday, with a leather portfolio and the particular efficiency of a woman who had been drawing up legal documents for 30 years and did not waste motion. She shook my hand. set the portfolio on the tray table, and walked me through each page without editorializing. She had a way of presenting documents clear, sequential, no flourish that I had always appreciated. She let the language speak for itself. The will was 12 pages. She had tabbed the signature lines in yellow. I read it through twice. The language was precise. Daniel Brooks, named as primary beneficiary. The house on Birchwood Drive. The retirement account. The life insurance policy. Mitchell Construction to be liquidated. Proceeds directed to the Michael Brooks Skilled Trades Scholarship Fund to be administered by the Grand Rapids Community Foundation. Ryan Mitchell named as secondary beneficiary to receive $50,000 from the estate, consistent with the expressed wishes of Linda Ann Mitchell as documented in her original will and subsequent communications. That last clause had been Margaret's addition. I had not asked for it, but when I read it, I understood why she had included it. She was protecting the document. She was making clear that the $50,000 was not an afterthought or a punishment. It was a continuation of something Linda had wanted, preserved intact. It was a good instinct, and I told her so. She said, "I've been doing this long enough to know which details matter." Dr. Sarah Chen came in at 12:15. She had been James's surgeon, a precise woman in her early 40s who spoke in complete sentences and did not use filler words. I had liked her from the first consultation. She read the witness line, looked at me, and said, "You're sure about this?" "I am." She nodded and signed without further comment. The second witness was a nurse named Gerald Okafor, who had been on the floor since the night of the surgery. He had brought me water at 2 a.m. when I couldn't sleep, and we had talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular, the weather, the construction on the highway near the hospital. He was a steady, quiet man, and when Margaret explained what he was being asked to witness, he read the relevant section carefully before signing. He did not ask questions. He initialed where Margaret indicated, signed at the bottom, and said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Mitchell," before returning to his rounds. Margaret collected the signed copies, placed them in the portfolio, and snapped it shut. "I'll file the original this afternoon and send you certified copies within the week." She paused. "Is there anything else?" "No, that's everything." She looked at me for a moment, the look of a lawyer who has learned not to say everything she thinks, but who thinks carefully. Then she picked up her portfolio and said, "Take care of yourself, James." "I intend to." She left. Dr. Chen had already gone. Gerald Okafor was somewhere down the hall. The room was quiet again, the same quality of quiet it had held for 3 days, with the monitors and the gray-blue light and the sound of the parking lot below. Daniel was not in the room when I signed. I had asked him, that morning, if he would mind getting coffee from the cafeteria. He had looked at me with the particular alertness of someone who understands when they are being given a reason to leave the room, and he had said, "Sure. You want anything?" I told him black, 1 sugar. He had been gone for 40 minutes. He came back 10 minutes after Margaret left, carrying 2 cups and a paper bag that turned out to contain a blueberry muffin, which he set on the tray table without comment. He sat down in his chair. He handed me the coffee. I took it. I held it for a moment, feeling the warmth through the paper cup. The coffee was exactly right, not too hot, not too weak. He had gotten it right both days. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Better," I said. "A little more like myself." He nodded. He opened the paper bag and broke off a piece of the muffin for himself and left the rest for me, and we sat there for a while without talking, the way 2 people can sit together when they have nothing to prove to each other. I thought about Ryan. I had been thinking about him, in pieces, for 3 days, not with anger, which had surprised me, but with something closer to clarity. I thought about the phone call 2 nights before the surgery, and the sound of his voice when he said the word golf, and the particular quality of his silence when I told him I understood. I thought about the years before, that the dinners that got shorter, the calls that got less frequent, The way Ashley's name had gradually begun to appear at the beginning of every sentence that ended with a reason he couldn't make it. I did not blame Ashley entirely. Ryan was a grown man. He made his own choices. But I thought about Linda, too. I thought about what she had said to me once, in the last year of her life, when Ryan had missed her birthday because of a work trip that I later learned had been optional. She had said, very quietly, "I think he's going to need to learn some things the hard way. James, I just hope we're around to see him come through the other side of it." She had not been angry. She had been tired and clear-eyed, and she had loved him in the specific way of a mother who sees her child accurately and loves him anyway. I was keeping her $50,000. That was not nothing. That was Linda's voice, still in the room, still saying, "I want him to have something to start with." I was honoring that. The rest was mine to decide. And I had decided. I drank my coffee. The muffin was good. Outside the window, the afternoon light was doing something particular to the parking lot, long shadows, the kind you only get in late autumn, when the sun sits low and everything looks a little more defined than usual. Daniel said, "You look like you're thinking about something." "I am," I said. "Anything you want to talk about?" I considered it. Then I said, "No, I think it's settled." He accepted that without pushing, the way he accepted most things without requiring more than I was offering. He finished his piece of the muffin and folded the bag neatly and set it aside, and then he picked up the book he'd been reading, the same paperback he'd had since the first day, and opened it to his page. "I signed the new will that day. I have never been more sure about anything in my life." Those are the words I said to Margaret at 5 in the morning, and they were true then. And they were true at 12:15 when Dr. Chen signed her name below mine, and they were true in the afternoon when the light came through the window and Daniel sat 3 feet away reading his book and asking for nothing. The document was filed that afternoon. Margaret sent me the certified copies 6 days later, in a manila envelope with her firm's return address in the upper left corner. I put them in the fireproof box in the closet of the house on Birchwood Drive, next to Linda's copy of her own will and the folder of insurance documents and the photograph of Michael and me at the groundbreaking for the Lakeview project in 1998, both of us squinting into the sun, neither of us knowing yet what the next 30 years would ask of us. I did not tell Ryan. I did not tell anyone. I closed the box and went to make dinner, and the house was quiet around me. And that was enough. 4 months passed. The scar on my chest faded from red to pink to something I stopped noticing when I buttoned my shirts in the morning. Dr. Chen had cleared me for full activity in week 10. By month 3, I was back on job sites, not swinging anything, not climbing scaffolding, but walking the perimeter of the Halstead Avenue project with my clipboard, checking drainage grades and talking to the crew foreman the way I'd been doing for 31 years. The work was the same. I was different in ways I hadn't fully mapped yet. Daniel came by most Thursdays. We'd developed a rhythm without discussing it. He'd arrive around 6. I'd have something on the stove. We'd eat and talk about whatever was in front of us. His students. A drainage issue I was working through on paper. A book he'd been reading. The conversations didn't have a shape I could describe, but they had weight. The kind of weight that accumulates slowly and means something by the time you notice it. Ryan called less. When he called, the calls were short. He'd ask how I was. I'd say fine. He'd say good. And then there'd be a pause, and he'd say he had to get going. I'd say of course. He never asked what I'd been eating, or whether my energy was back, or how the Halstead project was coming along. He asked how I was the way you ask the cashier how their day is going, a transaction, not a question. I answered the same way. I thought about the conversation I needed to have for longer than I should have. I kept telling myself there was time, that I'd find the right moment, that perhaps things would shift on their own. Then one Thursday evening, after Daniel had gone home, I sat in the kitchen with the lights low and understood that I was waiting for something that wasn't going to arrive by itself. I picked up the phone. Ryan answered on the 3rd ring. He sounded slightly distracted, the way he always did when he was half watching something in the background. I told him I needed to tell him something and that I wanted him to hear it from me, not from a lawyer. There was a pause. He said, "Dad, why would you? I'm your son." I said I knew. That's why I was telling him. I told him I'd changed my will. I told him he had a choice. Now he could choose to be part of my life, or he could choose the life he'd been building with Ashley, but he couldn't choose both and expect me to reward him for the choosing. He said, "This is about the surgery, isn't it? Because I went to golf." I let that sit for a moment. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a car passed on Birchwood Drive, its headlights sweeping briefly across the window. "No. Ryan," I said, "it's about the last 8 years. It's about the fact that when I was in the hospital, Daniel, who is not my son, sat next to my bed, and you, who is my son, didn't even call to ask how I was until it was over." He said he had called. He said he'd asked how I was. "You called to check a box," I said. "You didn't come, and that's your choice. But choices have consequences." I told him what the document said. I told him Daniel would inherit the house on Birchwood Drive, the retirement accounts, and the life insurance policy. I told him he would receive $50,000 because his mother had wanted him to have that, and I honored what Linda wanted. The remainder, the bulk of what I'd built over 31 years, would fund a scholarship in Michael's name, administered through the community college, for students in the trades. I told him I hoped someday he would understand why. He was quiet for longer than I expected. When he spoke, his voice had changed. The distraction was gone. What replaced it was something harder and younger, something that reminded me of the boy he'd been at 14 when he didn't get what he wanted. "You can't do this," he said. "I'll fight it. I'll get a lawyer." "You can," I said. "That's your choice too. But Margaret Walsh is one of the best estate attorneys in the state, and she witnessed everything. You'll spend more money fighting than you'll gain. I hope you make the right choice." I hung up. I sat with the phone on the table for a while. Then I turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. The reading of the will happened 7 months after that conversation, because that is when I died quietly, in the way my doctor had warned me was possible given the arterial condition we'd been monitoring since the surgery. I was 63. The house on Birchwood Drive was very clean. I had made sure of that. I know what happened in Margaret's office because Daniel told me what he imagined it would be like once during one of our Thursday evenings, and because Margaret told him afterward what actually occurred, and because the truth of it was close enough to what anyone would have predicted that the details hardly mattered. Ryan sat across from Margaret Walsh in her office on the 14th floor of the Meridian building downtown. Ashley was not with him. Margaret had a copy of the document on the table between them, the same document I had signed in the hospital room 8 months earlier, witnessed by Margaret herself and by a notary named Carol Hendricks, who had been with Margaret's firm for 19 years. Ryan read through it. Margaret said he turned very pale by the 3rd page. When he finished, he set it down and said, "This is insane. He's punishing me." Margaret said, "He's not punishing you. He's choosing. That's what parents do. They choose who gets their legacy. Your father chose Daniel." Ryan said he was going to contest it. Margaret told him, calmly and without any particular inflection, that he was welcome to retain counsel and pursue that course, that the document had been prepared and witnessed according to every legal requirement in the state of Michigan, that I had been examined by Dr. Chen 6 weeks before signing and found to be of entirely sound mind and body, and that the cost of litigation would likely exceed the $50,000 he stood to receive. She slid a second document across the table. It was a letter I had written to Ryan, sealed, with his name on the front in my handwriting. She said I had asked her to give it to him in person. He didn't open it in the office. He took it and left. Daniel found out differently. I had asked Margaret to arrange for Daniel to come to the office the following day. He arrived at 10 in the morning, in the corduroy jacket he wore when he wasn't teaching, and Margaret brought him into the conference room where I had asked her to set up one photograph on the table, the one of Michael and me at the Lakeview groundbreaking in 1998, both of us squinting into the sun. Margaret read him the relevant sections. Daniel sat very still. When she finished, he looked at the photograph for a long time without speaking. Then he said, quietly, "He didn't have to do this." Margaret said, "He knew that. He did it anyway." What I had written for Daniel in a separate letter, also sealed, also delivered by Margaret, was shorter than the letter to Ryan. I had written, "Daniel, you're going to be okay. You're going to have a home and security, and you're going to be able to teach for as long as you want without worrying about money, because you showed me what it means to be a son, not by blood, but by choice. Your father saved my life once. You saved it again, differently. Take care of the house. The gutters on the north side need attention every fall. James." Daniel cried. Margaret gave him a moment and then offered him water, and he laughed a little at that, the way you laugh when something catches you sideways. And she said my name had come up in her office more times in the past year than she could count, and that she had never once doubted what I intended or why. 3 days after that meeting, Ryan drove to Birchwood Drive. Daniel told me this part later, in the way he told me things without drama, just the facts laid out in order. He had been in the backyard that Saturday morning, talking to Carol from next door over the fence. Carol had lived there 22 years. She knew the house the way neighbors know houses, the gutters, the driveway cracks, the particular sound the gate made in winter. She had brought over a casserole the week Daniel moved in, and they had stood in the kitchen for 40 minutes talking about nothing important, which is how you know someone means to stay. Ryan pulled into the driveway at 10:15. He got out of his car and walked to the front door and knocked. Daniel came around from the backyard. Carol came with him because she had been mid-sentence and didn't think to stop. Ryan looked at Daniel, then at Carol, then back at Daniel. "I need to talk to you," Ryan said, "about the house. About what my father did." Daniel said, "Okay." "This was my family's house," Ryan said. His voice had the particular quality of a man who had rehearsed this on the drive over and was now delivering it to the wrong audience. "I grew up here. My mother died here. And he just gave it to you. You're not even family." Carol didn't say anything. She was holding her coffee mug with both hands and looking at Ryan with the expression of a woman who has lived next door to a house for 22 years and knows exactly who came and who didn't. Daniel said, "I know this is hard, Ryan." "Don't," Ryan said. "Don't do that. You knew him. What, 8 years I'm his son." "I know," Daniel said, "and he left you something. He told me that. He wanted you to have what your mother wanted you to have. $50,000. Ryan said it like a number he'd been carrying around all week, turning it over, looking for the insult in it. Out of everything he built. Carol set her coffee mug down on the porch railing. Slowly. The sound of ceramic on wood was very small in the quiet morning. She looked at Ryan and said, "He was in the hospital for 3 days. Honey, I brought James casseroles for 6 months after Linda passed. I watched his driveway. You came twice." She picked her mug back up. "I'm not trying to be unkind. I'm just telling you what I saw." Ryan stood there for a moment. Then he walked back to his car. He didn't say anything else. He pulled out of the driveway and drove down Birchwood Drive and did not come back. Daniel stood on the porch with Carol for a while after that. She said, "He'll be all right eventually. People usually are." Daniel said he hoped so. Then they went back to the fence and finished the conversation they'd been having, because the morning was still there and the yard still needed looking at. Ryan's letter was longer. I had written it the same night I'd made the phone call, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp on and the house quiet around me. I told him I loved him. I told him I had loved him since the morning he was born, since the first time I held him in that hospital room and understood what it meant to be responsible for another person's entire existence. I told him I was not angry. I told him I was tired, and that tired is different from angry, and I hoped he would learn the difference before it cost him something he couldn't get back. I told him his mother had loved him completely and without reservation, and that $50,000 was her love made material, and that he should not spend it quickly. I told him the scholarship fund would carry Michael's name for as long as the college stood, and that someday, If he drove past it and saw a student walking out with a certificate in hand, I hoped he would feel something other than what he was feeling now. I told him I hoped he and Ashley were happy. I meant it. I don't know if he opened the letter that day or later or at all. I don't know if he contested the will. I don't know if he eventually drove past the college and thought of Michael, or of me, or of the golf trip he took the day I went into surgery. Those are his choices now. He has always had them. That was never the problem. What I know is the house on Birchwood Drive. I know the gutters on the north side, and the way the kitchen light falls in the late afternoon, and the fireproof box in the closet with Linda's papers and Michael's photograph. I know that Daniel will walk through that door on a Thursday evening, and the house will not be empty. I know that a student somewhere in Grand Rapids will learn a trade with money that carries Michael Brooks's name, because Michael saved my life on a job site in 1996, and the debt runs forward, not back. That first October, Daniel climbed a ladder on a Saturday morning and cleared the gutters on the north side of the house. He did it without being reminded. He had read the letter. That is the whole of it. That is what I built. The morning after he cleared the gutters, Daniel made coffee in the kitchen on Birchwood Drive. He set 2 cups on the counter. Then he stopped and looked at them for a moment. 2 cups. The same ceramic pot Linda had bought at a craft fair in 1992. The same counter I had stood at for 41 years. He left both cups out. If these stories find something true in you, I'll be here.